And any threats made against law enforcement, including the men and women of the FBI, as with any law enforcement agency, are deplorable and dangerous. We have in this country had over the last few years an alarming rise in violence against law enforcement.
Turning to our special report tonight, that's FBI Director Chris Wray rebuking attacks on law enforcement. Wray was appointed by Trump, but is directly confronting how Trump, MAGA, and right-wing agitators are encouraging violence against police, including in response to the search of Trump's home. The FBI and DHS also issuing a very grave joint warning of a spike in threats to law enforcement, including from Trump supporters who were seen carrying pistols and assault-type rifles at an Arizona FBI office, while that armed man wearing body armor was trying to breach the FBI's Cincinnati field office for an apparent attack Thursday.
Authorities in Ohio in a standoff with a man they say tried to break into the FBI's Cincinnati office.
A man armed with an AR-15 style rifle tried to breach an FBI office today. And now we're learning he had been at the Capitol on January 6th.
Today, an armed man in Ohio allegedly attempted to breach an FBI field office, leading to a shootout where the suspect was killed.
The FBI is fortifying security at its headquarters in all field offices. Our cameras caught some of those preparations as this has gone forward. So this is a time for a sober reality check for the nation. Donald Trump attempted a coup and personally organized the gathering that turned into a violent insurrection to try to stop the peaceful transfer of power. Republican leaders have largely warmed to Trump's public brazen embrace of illegal violence as a warning and a threat and as a reality practiced. Now Trump's out of power, and this court-supervised use of legal steps to protect national security is being met with open and new threats of violence against the FBI, against police, against judges. As domestic political terrorism has increased over the last 2 decades, there are about 2,700 open cases now. Then we have something that is rife in our public debate. You have people who refer to this criminal violence as a potential reason to surrender, to appease these people, to hand some sort of veto over possible searches or indictments to the would-be thugs and criminals threatening or acting on armed rebellion. You don't need to be a history buff to know how appeasement fails. And then you might ask, what's next? Donald Trump invoking his vigilante army as an active threat against the government he once led? Well, that's what he just did, albeit in secret, according to a bombshell report in the New York Times, that Trump sent an ally who had apparently high-level access to the DOJ to pass along a message. Trump wanted Garland to know that he had been checking in with people around the country and found them to be enraged by the search. Well, the FBI is issuing warnings and bulletins about these people, these Trump fans enraged by the search, who are threatening violence and illegal retribution. So this is not exactly a news bulletin over at the FBI and DOJ. Let me be clear. Legally, this is outrageous. Donald Trump, the subject of a search, invoking those enraged people in what sounds like a threat. It's also improper for a subject to try to make these contacts to the top of the AG, the Attorney General of the United States, even if the subject in this case is the former president, let alone issue these kind of threats. The report says Trump was suggesting he basically has leverage but could somehow reduce the threats, or by implication, not reduce them. The New York Times reporting the substance of Trump's message was, quote, "The country is on fire. What can I do to reduce the heat?" The idea there is that he's in control of the heat, he alone. A kind of creepy, threatening message for the Attorney General is how Washington Post's Jennifer Rubin put it. Trump then rushed to sort of launder this move in public, telling a Fox News online reporter that he's out now to publicly do whatever he can to help the country. The temperature has to be brought down. You know that move if you follow the news. Donald Trump gets busted trying to do something in secret, so he rushes out in public, and then later people say, hey, he said it in public, how bad can it be? And the answer legally is very bad. This is not subtle. And no one thinks of Donald Trump as someone who brings down the temperature. That's not his thing. His most loyal supporters don't think that about him. None of this even claims to treat the probe as valid where evidence and facts determine the legal steps. Someone treating the probe as valid could have their lawyer call the AG to say, or the DOJ to say, we really are innocent, we want to cooperate, we think the facts will show that. Trump views this as an amoral battle of power, where his threats and leverage can be wielded. And in that sense, in Trump's mind, maybe he does see Garland as more scary, as a more intimidating adversary than he realized. So this is Trump's version of a rare, potentially conciliatory gesture in his mind. But it's wrong. Federal investigations are not some deal. They're not a battle between the subject and the prosecutor. And they certainly are never supposed to be subject to threats of violence. If they were, no gangster would ever be held accountable, and this would be an even more dangerous nation to live in. This is ugly stuff. And there are people who'd rather look away and hope it just goes away. And they'd rather do that than confront the fact that our nation's most recent president is threatening a violent rebellion. But then again, wake up, America. He already did that once in public in 2021 just to try to keep a job he liked. If anyone is surprised he's doing it in 2022 to keep his potential liberty, then you haven't been paying attention. And I promise you, this is a time to pay attention to the threats and the evidence and to face them down in whatever way you can in your life and role as a citizen, and to soberly back the rule of law, period.
New developments on the authorized FBI search of former President Trump's Mar-a-Lago home.
The FBI says since that search, it's been facing an unprecedented number of threats of violence. Our D.C. Bureau Chief Ben Kennedy live on Washington with much more. Ben.
Calvin Nicole, the FBI says those threats you were talking about are very concerning and are taking them seriously. In the meantime, on social media, Trump is now accusing agents of taking his passports during this search. New security concerns 1 week after the FBI search of former President Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago estate. It's there the FBI and Department of Homeland Security put out a joint intelligence bulletin warning of an increase in threats and acts of violence, including armed encounters against law enforcement. Florida Senator Marco Rubio, who is among Republican lawmakers defending Trump, tweeted, anyone threatening violence over the Mar-a-Lago raid should be arrested. It comes after agents removed more than 20 boxes from Trump's Florida estate, including 11 sets of classified documents. It's those top secret materials that investigators are focusing on Monday, tracking down who's seen or handled the materials, even checking for fingerprints, as agents questioned former Trump administration officials to find out if any of the information was compromised. ABC News reports that in June, a Trump attorney signed a statement telling federal prosecutors that all classified documents at his Florida home had been turned over. Trump claims he declassified the records, but stopped short of providing evidence of that.
Y'all ready?
This as in Georgia, a federal judge in Atlanta denied Senator Lindsey Graham's motion to squash a subpoena, ruling that he must testify before a grand jury, investigating then President Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election. And former Trump lawyer Rudy Giuliani was also informed today that he is a target of a Georgia criminal investigation probe. I'll have more on that coming up at 5. Reporting live in Washington, D.C., Ben Kennedy, Local 10 News.
Security is visibly tighter at FBI offices after a weekend intelligence bulletin warned of an increase in threats to federal law enforcement officers and even their families, including threats of a dirty bomb outside FBI headquarters and general calls for civil war and armed rebellion.
As soon as the news broke about the FBI search of Mar-a-Lago, there was a tidal wave of anger and animus that came from radical supporters of President Trump.
Donald Trump's possession of top secret documents has led the Justice Department to probe possible violations of the Espionage Act and obstruction of justice. On Monday, Trump claimed the FBI even took his passports in the search. All the while, the former president and his allies have kept up their verbal attacks on the FBI, some naming agents and even the judge who authorized the search warrant.
The FBI has been acting like a bunch of thugs. I don't know if they're direct or they're just doing it on their own.
Who is to say in this kind of case that some of the documents supposedly seized were not planted there to begin with?
Over the weekend, Trump supporters rallied outside local FBI offices.
The FBI has been specifically targeting conservatives in this country.
Last week's attack on an FBI office in Cincinnati was carried out by a Trump supporter armed with a nail gun and an AR-15 style rifle. He posted extensively on Trump's Truth Social site.
If a small swath of Republicans take it seriously and follow through, turning their violent threats into violent action, we could be in for a really chaotic and dangerous time.
Trump told Fox News he's willing to help bring down the temperature because of what he called tremendous anger in the country, yet there's little sign of what steps he might take to make that happen, at a time when multiple investigations could deliver serious consequences.
What makes the current threats so difficult to confront is that they're not concentrated around a single date or event like we saw with January 6th. But each day closer to November's midterms and each new revelation in the Trump investigations seems to heighten the risks. Farah?
Jackson Prosco in Washington. Thank you, Jackson.
To discuss all of this is the award-winning historian and professor of history and American studies at Yale University, Dr. Joanne Freeman. Dr. Freeman, good to see you in real life again. It's nice for you to be here. I was alarmed on Monday when so much of this talk went from Donald Trump talking about witch hunt. It moves very quickly into fighting back and even the terminology civil war. And it's not rare. We've had people talking about civil war for the last 5 years. And then we see it move into action. And that's very alarming. There's no point at which Donald Trump or his circle have come out and disowned what happened in Cincinnati. But this person's actions, he tied directly to what happened in Mar-a-Lago and the fact that the FBI was on a witch hunt.
Right. Well, and I have a number of problems with branding whatever's going on right now a civil war. In part, as you're suggesting, it's an escalating phrase, right? So whatever's going on, it suggests something formal. It suggests something structured and organized. And right now, none of that is true, thankfully. But the other reason why I have a problem with that, calling anything that, is because oddly enough, I'm going to say it's comforting, which is going to sound counterintuitive, but in American history, when you say civil war, you think about a specific event. And
out of which much good came.
Exactly.
Identified as a positive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so when you say that, we're going to go into civil war, it links immediately back to the Civil War. Right. Both sides, something that was framed, and, it takes away what I think is the real ugliness and violence beneath the surface of what's going on right now, right? This is largely extremist violence that we're seeing right now. This isn't a civil war. Now, we could argue about what gets up to the sort of measurement of civil war, but I think that hides things. I think it's a kind of history mask for what's really going on, which is not structured.
Which is, okay, so let's take that. What's happening is not structured. It is extremist. It's a lot of things, but one of the things that Ben Collins and I were talking about a couple of nights ago is that it's not coming from the deepest, darkest, grossest corners of the internet. This is actually fairly mainstream. This guy was an attendee at January 6th. He's a big believer in Donald Trump, and he took Donald Trump's words that this is a witch hunt and this is really bad and we're not going to take it anymore and we're going to fight back, which is language that you find very commonly across media these days.
Right. And that's an important thing because what it shows, and it's, again, something that might seem counterintuitive, is the importance of words, that words and rhetoric really matter, particularly if they're coming from someone high up. Not only do they frame things, but they're a way of sort of setting things in motion. I think that rhetoric is threatening, and we see this all the time, right? We've seen this during the January 6 hearings, that a threat comes out, and then there's a lot of threats that follow it, and there may not be specific violence that comes of it, but now anyone who's been threatened is going to be aware that there might be violence, and that's the power of these violent words, these threats, this rhetoric. Nothing has to happen necessarily, although in this case it did, even worse. But just the idea that there are these threats has an impact, and in some cases silences people. They self-censor because they don't want to get themselves in the middle of that kind of a mix-up.
We've got now politicians who are calling to defund the FBI, which is ironic because they didn't like the defund the police language. Marjorie Taylor Greene is selling equipment, gear caps and things like that. But Paul Gosar, the Arizona representative, tweeted, "I will support a complete dismantling and elimination of the Democrat brown shirts known as the FBI. This is too much for our republic to withstand." And then he adds a whole bunch of people who are either conspiracy theorists or election deniers, or Carrie Lake, who's going to be the Republican candidate for governor in Arizona. The question here is the degree to which this now overlaps with reality. These are people who are elected officials or soon to be elected officials or have very, very big voices in what has become mainstream conservative media.
No, absolutely. And first of all, brown shirts does the same thing that Civil War does, which is it's like, oh, no, Nazis, right? This is something foreign. It's not American. We can sort of frame it in somebody else's conflict. We own this, number one. You're right. Number two, it's coming from people on high. It's going to have an important impact. So for sure, the higher up it goes, the more public it is, the more of an impact it's going to have and the more dangerous it is.
But are we post debate on this? I mean, how do you fix this when officials who like Donald Trump and don't like Democrats move to this direction and start this conversation, then people take action? It's like that guy who shot up the pizza parlor in Washington. He didn't kill anyone, but he really thought he was rescuing babies from, the basement of a place that didn't have a basement. What is the methodology for solving this?
That's a big question, Ali. I will say there is one thing that kind of comment about FBI brown shirts sort of elides, and that's happening a lot among some people on the right, and that is forgetting about the rule of law. The fact that there are laws that can be violated, the fact that violating them has an impact. You can brown shirt people all you like, but the fact of the matter is, if they're abiding by the law, if they're held to the law, that is a system not only of aggression, but a system of restraint. And right now there's a lot going on among some on the right that is kind of assuming that some people are above the rule of law. And that's not only incorrect, obviously that's dangerous.
Do you see, I mean, this was a fairly benign matter in that it was not a raid of Mar-a-Lago. It was an effort over months and months and months to get information, and then it seemed to be quite a polite search of the whole place. Everything seems to trigger this kind of overheated reaction. And again, we can discount the fact that some of it comes from politicians, but are you worried about the degree to which people hear this stuff and decide to act on their own?
Well, yes, and particularly, in an ideal world, you might say there wouldn't be social media, and then we wouldn't know within a nanosecond, like, oh, this happened, what does it mean? Because we don't know a lot of the details. They're sort of coming out, spilling out, leaking out, being revealed. Ideally, we wouldn't have people flying off because we wouldn't be as immersed or seemingly immersed in it as we are. So, yeah, it's totally true. And again, social media heats this sort of thing up, obviously, that someone makes a charge. And nowadays, what is reality when people are messing with video and doing all kinds of things? It's very easy to see how a false charge, how a lie, how manipulated video of some kind can send people off in a direction. And, your question is a big one. Then what do you do? And I think reminding people about the rule of law is an important part of it, but that's not the answer.
Yeah, this is a tricky one. Joanne, good to see you as always. Thank you for being with us. Dr. Joanne Freeman is an award-winning historian and professor of history and American studies at Yale University and a prolific author. I read her stuff and I follow her on Twitter, and you should too.